All right, guys, tonight's session is promoting effective teamwork between families, schools, and staff professionals. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Bruey, and she's amazing, so I'm excited for this. She is the program supervisor at Autism Solutions in Lancaster, and she has been working with individuals on the autism spectrum for almost 40 years now. All right, Dr. Bruey, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I recognize some faces, or not faces, but names, so that's good. It looks like we have sort of a smaller crowd tonight compared to last week, which I'm hoping will allow people to be a little bit more participatory than last week. I'm going to actually prompt you guys to give me some ideas and discuss some of the things I talk about periodically. So here comes the tech part. Are we going to be able to do this? Let's see. Hold on. All right, I'm going to count on you, Lakin, to tell me what you see. Are you seeing the
Oh, I was muted. We're good to go.
Okay. Oh, sorry, good. Okay, good. All right. So as Lakin said, we're going to talk tonight about promoting effective teamwork between families and schools. And I said staff professionals, but it's really a lot of the concepts that we're going to be covering tonight can be applied to anybody you're working with, any team you're working with, whether it's school team or, if you're getting IBHS services in the home, etc. So hopefully we'll be able to generalize it. Okay, so let's get started. First, from a personal perspective, I was in private practice by myself for 20 years. And then 20 years ago, I joined the IU13. Which is obviously an education system. And I joined the IU13. I had a contract with them. Everybody got along. I said, okay, I'm going to give up the private practice. Let me come up. They asked me to join them as an employee supervisor. It worked out really well. But I'll tell you, it was a huge shift for me to go from a private practice setting by myself to being in the IU13. And I don't know how the IU is out by you guys, but the IU13 has, oh gosh, probably 1,000 employees, 100 classrooms across Lancaster, Lebanon counties. It's a very, very big program. And so not only did I have to get used to being part of this big system, but I also didn't have the background and knowledge base regarding education that I probably should have walking into that job. So there was a learning curve in the sense of what is a school responsible for? What are the people in the school, different staff, what are their roles, etc. And as you'll talk about, hopefully with me, and I'll emphasize, is that one of the main ways to make sure teamwork is effective is to know everybody's role and everybody's expectations. So I'm going to spend some time talking about what are the roles and expectations, especially in terms of school systems. So back to this idea of when I switched from private practice to becoming part of an education system, I really have learned so much, especially those first few years in terms of what a school's responsible for, what they're not responsible for, etc. And to the point where I remember being in a meeting and I said something afterwards. And I said, oh gosh, that was stupid what I said. And somebody said, oh no, you're getting a lot better. And I didn't know I was doing so bad. So it was a learning curve for me. So here are the goals for tonight. I want you to understand, oops. Here they are. Sorry, switched again a bit there. Sorry about that. So here are the goals. We're going to review various state and federal regulations mandated within the education system so that you will understand the big picture of what is special education all about federally, nationally, as well as within the state. Promote a better understanding what school systems are and are not responsible, and what are they mandated to provide and what are they not mandated to provide, to decrease the possibility that families get frustrated because they feel the schools aren't providing the services that the parents think they should. The third goal is provide guidance as to how to read and understand educational documents and treatment plans to increase your ability to understand what schools are actually proposing and to be able to give your input, because as parents, you're essential as IEP team members. And the last goal is to explore strategies to facilitate a strong sense of teamwork between parents, and school systems. All right, so person perspective. Now we're going to talk a bit about the big picture. And let's start federal. What is special educational federal regulations? And a lot of you have heard of IDEA. And as a parent, it's really important for y'all to understand IDEA as much as possible. So I encourage you to read up on it if you haven't yet. So it's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it guarantees what's called FAPE, free appropriate public education, to provide eligible or FAPE to eligible children with disabilities throughout the United States. So that FAPE is a term you want to know about, because when I've been at due process hearings or educational settings, things like that, a lot of people will say, well, are we providing FAPE? You need to make sure we're providing FAPE. And it's an odd term because it's free appropriate public education. Well, what's appropriate? What defines appropriate? And of course, there's subjectivity in terms of what one educator might think is appropriate, another one doesn't, what one parent thinks is appropriate, another parent doesn't, etc. So IDEA also governs how states and public agencies provide early intervention. So it's not just school age, it's early intervention as well, special education and related services to infants, toddlers, and school age children. So that's a wide breadth of populations that IDEA covers. And there are different, when you look at IDEA, it's split up into age groups for the most part. And it's also split up in terms of the identification. So for instance, there's a whole section on gifted children and of course, one on special ed as well. And prior to federal education regulation, most children with disabilities did not receive any formal education. So for instance, again, I've been doing this a long time, maybe it'll be 40 years since I got my doctorate. When I first started, most special ed systems, classrooms, were in segregated settings. They were in trailers, they were in, you know, piecemeal kind of outbuildings next to a school, but they weren't integrated way back then. And that was really, really problematic for a lot of students because they weren't having any exposure to general ed students, but that's all that was provided. That was the norm, unfortunately. So IDEA first passed, the first term title was called Education for All Handicapped Children. That was back in 1975. So again, remember, I got my doctorate in 82. So when I started, it was only 7 years into even that policy. So before 1975, kids with special education needs were not required to get education. They were at home for the most part, which obviously was horrific in terms of their eventual progress. But so thank God that came about in 1975. And then in 1982, for instance, as an example, 80% of special education students had only been receiving services for at most 7 years. And again, they were highly segregated settings as far as the special education. They were seen as, you know, second-class citizens, frankly, and second-class students, which was, you know, had a lot to improve. So IDEA is composed of 4 parts. Part A covers the general provisions of the law, just in general. What are the general kinds of concepts? Part B covers assistance for education for children with disabilities. Part C covers the infants and toddlers with disabilities, including children from birth to 3. And Part D consists of the national support programs administered at the federal level. So depending upon how old your child is and as well as in terms of what kind of special education services they need, you would want to get yourself very versed on Part A, B, C, or D. Okay, so when you look at IDEA, you'll see that there are 14 identified disabilities. And here they are between this one and the next slide. And the main reason I want parents to know this is because these are the disabilities, the only disabilities that school systems are allowed to use. This is across the nation. So your child might have a special needs that's not on one of these lists, or better put, might have a diagnosis that's not on one of these lists. one of these identified disabilities. So let's go through them a little bit, just to give you an idea. So the first one, it's the most common one, is specific learning disability. Some of your kids might have been identified as having a specific learning disability. It could be in math, it could be in reading, it could be reading, math, and handwriting. It could be multiple sections, but SLD is a really, really common identified disability. The next one on the list is called other health impairment. Frankly, this is the catch-all one that's often used when there's something else going on that's not on the list but the child still needs an IEP, because the child has to have one of these disabilities in order to get an IEP. So other health impairment is often used for instance, kids with ADHD, because ADHD is not on the list. So kids with ADHD that need an IEP, their identified disability is probably going to be OHI. Another example might be somebody, child with a mental health disorder, anxiety, depression, social anxiety, school refusal, things like that. That might be, because none of them are identified IDEA disabilities, that might be a disability that can be sort of sandwiched into OHI, that other health impairment. More commonly, it's things like kids that have physical ailments, medical ailments that are causing them to have need in IEP. The next one is autism. And autism is my passion and my love, and has been for many, many years. I just love the population. Autism, a couple of things you want to know about that. One is that the autism, the IDEA definition of autism, and all these, if you go online and you Google IDEA and disabilities, each of these will have a little paragraph of exactly what type of disability falls within each of these bullets. And autism, in contrast to what's called a medical diagnosis for autism, the IDEA definition of autism is really pretty blurry. It's probably 3 or 4 sentences at the most. And it basically says the child has some qualitative impairments with social skills, or qualitative impairments of communication, and perhaps the presence of ritualistic repetitive behaviors, etc. But it's this like tiny little paragraph. In contrast, if you look at the medical definition of autism spectrum disorders as put out by the American Psychiatric Association, it's a much more extensive list of, they have sort of the same 3 categories of communication issues, social issues, and the presence of ritualistic repetitive behaviors, but it's much more fine-tuned in terms of how many bullets and how it's described, etc. But either way, it would be considered autism. Those of you that have older kids, you might have children that are now teens, or maybe even young adults that are still in school because they're not 21 yet, that had, and perhaps they had the disability identification in the past, the diagnosis of Asperger's disorder. Well, there's no bullet there in IDEA, there's no diagnosis of Asperger's disorder. So kids with Asperger's would be folded into that autism identification as per IDEA. The next one is speech or language impairment. This is also a very common disability category. And there are IEPs out there, just what they call speech only IEPs, where that's all that's going on. The child just needs some speech therapy. My son was funny because he had a gifted IEP and a speech IEP because he was a smart kid, but his artic wasn't great. So we talk about the algorithm and the multiplication, So he needed the speech to get his artic in better shape, but he also had the gifted. And you can have even kids, I know kids that have autism disability category as well as a gifted category. So you can have more than one. And in fact, when you look at your child's evaluation report or their IEPs or reevaluation reports, you'll remember when you go through them at those MDE meetings, they'll say primary disability is X, secondary disability is Y. Sometimes you have a secondary disability. You can even have a third tertiary disability. You don't have to. But if there's more than one of these, you can have more than one on your child's IEP. Next one is visual impairment, and that includes blindness, pretty straightforward. Deafness, again. Usually you have hearing impairment or fully deaf would be in there, or there's 2 bullets, excuse me. And then Sorry. The next one is deaf blindness. So there are some kids, it's pretty rare, but you have children that are both deaf and blind. Emotional disturbance is sort of an oddball, and when I say oddball, disability category is because there are a lot of people, that's an odd, horrible phrase, emotional disturbance. It sounds like somebody that's some sociopath, screaming and yelling. Emotional disturbance, when you look at the IDEA definition, it's really very clear cut in terms of what it involves, but what it's basically saying is the child's mental health issues are making it difficult for them to learn in school. So that would include everything from the kid that's acting out and trashing the classroom to the child that's very withdrawn and depressed. So, and anywhere in between. So emotional disturbance, I'm not crazy for the term, but that's how IDEA came up with them. Orthopedic impairment just means, kids that have different kinds of physiological issues, usually needing PT, et cetera. Intellectual disability, I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with that. And the way that intellectual disability is identified is that the student shows cognitive delays, and usually an IQ of 70 or below, and also shows what's called adaptive skill delays, meaning those daily living skills. Can they, do self-help stuff by themselves? How much supervision do they need to get through a day? Those kind of learning deficits, but you have to have both. So you might have somebody that's got, a relatively low IQ, but they're doing pretty good during the day and their adaptive skills are at average level. You would not use the ID disability category. Next one is traumatic brain injury. And this is for any child that has had some clearly identified trauma to their brain that's causing them to have trouble learning. It's usually some sort of concussion or some sort of, car accident where the child's brain has been impaired. So that would TBI would go in there. And then multiple disabilities means any, and it can be really, when you look at the definition, you'll see it's usually in practice, intellectual disability and something else. But when you look at the definition of multiple disabilities, it doesn't mandate that one of them has to be intellectual disability. And then the last one is developmental delay, and that's only used for early intervention, and you're allowed to let it go a little bit into kindergarten. And the reason that they allow that developmental delay with little ones is from 2 to 6, those ages, it's tough sometimes to really pinpoint exactly what's going on with a child. In fact, the IU13, I don't know about you all out there, but IU13, we have what's called diagnostic kindergarten classrooms, which are really neat because they're for kids that, we're not really sure what's going to make the most sense for this child come first grade. So let's put them in a classroom where they can get some intense teaching and then revisit it at the end of diagnostic K year to figure out what they need. So these are the IDEA disability categories that schools have to use. That's the only one. So these are the only ones. So if you have a child that doesn't fit neatly into one of these, sometimes it can be hard to get an IEP because you have to sort of massage some of these definitions in order to allow your student to get in. Okay, so now we're going to talk, that was broad, that was federal, that's national. Now we're going to funnel it down a little bit to Pennsylvania specifically. If you go online and you Google Chapter 14, Special Education for Pennsylvania, you'll see all the regs. And it's, of course, a hugely ridiculously lengthy document, but it's worth looking into and finding certain sections that you're interested in to figure out what things apply to my particular student. It has everything in there from what an evaluation should look like, what a reevaluation should look like, timelines for when things should be done, behavioral support plans, and whether the use of restraints and things like that. That's all defined in Chapter 14. And these are the regs that all the schools, the public schools in Pennsylvania, need to follow. So if the more you're familiar with that, if you have a question about, wait a minute, they're doing this with my child, I'm not sure this is a good idea, if you have that kind of question, then what you're going to want to do is go to chapter 14 and see if it, whatever's happening at that school really does follow the chapter 14 regs, because they're mandatory. If your child attends a non-public school, all bets are off. They don't have to follow chapter 14. They don't even have to follow IDEA. So I've often said to parents, if you've got a child with special needs, think hard before you go non-public. Now, I have a lot of parents that think, oh my gosh, my child's in this non-public school, they're doing so well, and I'm all for it, don't get me wrong. But it's a trade-off, because some non-public schools are really good about making sure there's accommodations and modifications are made to help a child with special needs to learn in the classroom. But they're not mandated, they're not mandated to do it. It's optional. So they might very well, say, no, we're not doing that. Go to your public school system if you want that. So this is all what I've been describing so far, all has to do with schools that are obtaining state and federal funding, because that's when these mandates come into play. Okay, so chapter 14 has, as I said, special education rights for students for attending public schools, what evaluations, reevaluations, behavioral supports, etc. are in there. So I would frankly be really, if I were a parent with a kid with special needs, I would want to look into that. It definitely follows IDEA regulations. It very closely follows IDEA regulations. But across the state, there are some minor differences. So if you came from another state, or you're planning on moving to another state, you want to get yourself familiar with whichever state that you're living in. Okay. Next one. So here's the thing you want to keep in mind when you're thinking about what are schools responsible for and what they're not responsible for. There's a phrase called access to education. And access to education means that schools are mandated to provide special education services if the child's mental health or behavioral concerns prohibit that access to education. The disability per se alone does not require special ed. If the disability keeps the child from learning, which is what access to education basically means, then yes, the schools are mandated to follow through with some special ed. And when you have an evaluation for a child, every initial evaluation and every reevaluation that's done, the psychologist and the IEP team basically have to answer two questions. And the first one is, does the child have a disability as defined by IDEA? Yes or no? And the second one is, does the child need specially designed instruction? Because again, even though the child might have an identified disability, if they're having no trouble accessing education, then they don't need special instruction, and therefore an IEP isn't required. And that's why you've seen this on evaluations and reevaluation reports. It's usually about halfway through. There's a part where those specific questions are listed in those reports, and the team has to say yes or no to each one of those questions. And both questions, again, have to be yes in order for the child to be eligible for an IEP. This drives some parents crazy, and some of you might be in that boat. And I get that, because you're saying, wait a minute, my child has, really some social skills needs, or my child really has, some behavioral acting out at home. I mean, my gosh, he's a terror at home. But if it's school, those behaviors aren't happening, and he or she is able to access education and learn and get good grades, etc., no IEP is required. There are other options that we could talk about if you want in terms of what parents can do, but the school is not required to provide an IEP for that scenario. Okay, next one. So I have some annotated documents from Patan. And if you don't know about Patan, I would absolutely encourage you to go online and look at patan.net. Patan is a statewide, Pennsylvania-specific program. It's called the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network. And it sounds at first like, oh, it's somebody that's just helping with tech stuff. It's not. Anything about education, whether it's general education, special education, etc. They provide workshops, they provide online trainings, they provide all kinds of documents, etc. So if you want to know about what kind of documents and what should be included in documents, go to Patan. So for instance, I'll show you this. Okay. Let me do this. Hold on. And I'm going to pull this over here. So I want you guys to tell me, what are you seeing, Laking? What are you seeing right now?
Right now, I'm seeing your PowerPoint. Are you trying?
Yeah. Let me shut that down then, maybe. How about now?
If you unshare and then reshare, usually it pulls up.
It's a good idea.
Like whatever you're trying to get up.
Yeah. Let's try that one. As I said to Lakin when we started here, you'd think that after 2 years, we'd have this down. Okay, what are you seeing now?
The annotated version.
Perfect. So this is taken straight from Patan. And what's nice about this is it takes the format that a lot of you have seen of an evaluation report. That's when the child is initially evaluated for the possibility of special education, it's a standardized template of a report that's used across Pennsylvania. And what's nice about this annotated version is it goes through each section of that report in order to let parents and educators know what's supposed to be in this section. So if you're looking at your child's evaluation report, that initial evaluation report, if you're new to special ed and they just got that evaluation report done, and you want to know what's supposed to be in each of those sections, this is a really, really cool resource. So you'll see it talks about the purpose of evaluation, and this looks familiar, right? When you look at that evaluation report, but notice it says specifically things here like the day of the report can be no more than 60 calendar days from receipt of the written parental consent. So it gives you timelines in here, not only what kind of content should be in each section, the reason for referral, again, so they have information here in terms of what's called the PRE, et cetera, which is your permission to reevaluate or to evaluate. And I'm not going to go into each one of these, obviously, but as you can see, these are the sections that you should be familiar with if your child's in special ed, because you've seen it lots of times. And I'm going to just scroll down to show you this section I referred to earlier. Here it is. Okay, so see how we have those two sections? Either A, the child doesn't have a disability at all, so we stop then, or yes, the child has a disability and is in need of special instruction, specially designed instruction, right? So that makes them eligible for special education. All right, I also want to show you Patan's reevaluation report. They have an annotated version, same deal, where they go through each of the sections. They start with what is the purpose of the reevaluation. They talk about how often they have to be done, things like that. Here's the reevaluation report template I'm sure you're familiar with. They have it here in terms of who needs to be at that meeting, in terms of that the copies of the reevaluation report must be disseminated to the parents at least 10 school days prior to the meeting. And you might know this, that when you have those meetings where you're looking at that reevaluation report and you say, okay, now we're going to switch and go to the IEP meeting, you as parents have the right to go, oh, no, I don't want to do that because I want to take 10 days to review this reevaluation report. I'm not totally on board, or I'm not totally sure about what's going on here. You have the right to wait 10 days. Most people, most parents say, you know what, I don't want to have another report or another meeting in 10 days. I'll waive my right, which means you have to literally sign it to say, okay, we're going to go straight from the evaluation report to the IEP, but you don't have to do that. So if you're ever in an IEP meeting and you feel, or an MDE meeting, excuse me, and you feel you're not ready to go to the IEP because you're just not sure about the evaluation report, say don't sign that waiver for the 10 days. And again, you see a lot of things in here in terms of what should be included in all the sections. The reevaluation report's very similar to the evaluation report, except for, I wanted to point out this, which is this one. You'll come to a box that says whether or not the IEP team determined that additional data are needed. Reevaluations, once a child's been identified for special education, reevaluations have to be done every 2 years for kids with intellectual disability, and every 3 years for every other student. Now, reevaluation, when it happens, this section right here, this question about additional data is very important, because parents are allowed, and IEP team in general are allowed to say, you know what, we have enough information from classroom-based instruction and grades and, you know, all that kind of stuff. We know where the child's, you know, what their cognitive skills are, et cetera, and we don't need any additional testing. If so, then you click, you know, you check that saying we don't need additional testing. If that's true, then the reevaluation report that you get will be basically known information, which is fine. You know, there's no reason to test a child if there's no underlying questions that aren't being answered by whatever information you had from the school setting. But if the IEP team, and you have to be part of this early on, when you sign that PTRE, that permission to reevaluate form, saying, okay, yep, it's my child's due for their every 2 years or every 3 year reevaluation, and you get a form. If it's one, you'll only get the permission to reevaluate form if additional testing is necessary. So if you think additional testing is necessary, make sure you talk to your IEP team. I supervise 18 psychologists, and there are times where a parent says, no, I need more testing because I don't know why that my child's not progressing or whatever. And when you talk for a while, you find out that, you know what, another IQ test or another achievement test isn't, or another rating scale isn't going to help us answer the question of why isn't my child progressing. So there are times where you go, you know what, instead of doing additional testing, let's look better at what's going on in the classroom and really get a finer tune rather than getting just, you know, yet one more IQ. But if you discuss with the rest of the IEP team and show, you know what, I do think additional testing is necessary, then we go to just another box that's down here somewhere. Okay, here it is. So the IEP team determined that there is a need for additional testing. So when that's determined, and that should be, you know, 30 or 60 days, a month or two before your child's due for that reevaluation, the folks at schools should be saying, hey, you know what, your child's reevaluation is coming up. What do you think? Do we need more testing? This is the data we have, et cetera. If they decide that additional testing is done, needs to be done, that's again when you would get a permission to evaluate form. And then that would, excuse me, be required in order for them to be able to do testing. However, back to this idea, if the IEP team decides, no, we don't need additional testing, then you'd still get a reevaluation report, but it would be all the current data in terms of school performance, et cetera. So that's what the reevaluation looks like. And the other thing I wanted to bring here, and I can send these to Lakin when I send the PowerPoints, I can send copies of these if you'd like, that's easy enough. But this is another resource that I've sent to parents. And I apologize for this particular copy because it's not great, but it's put out by the Pennsylvania Department of Ed, and it talks about all the guidelines. It's only about 5-6 pages long, but it's really informative in terms of, so you know your rights and what the school's rights and roles are. So for instance, you know, it goes through some key terms, but here's some idea in terms of, first section is that initial evaluation, and it talks about if you orally request an evaluation, then the school has to give you, have you sign up a form. The oral won't be enough. In fact, what's best, if you want an evaluation, if your child isn't identified as needing special ed, but you're thinking maybe they do, then you would want to put it in writing. So you have a date in terms of when you dropped it off. When that happens, within 10 days, they have to give you a form for permission to evaluate. And again, I'm not going to go into big deals, but you see, it gives you timelines and what the expectations are in terms of how quickly schools have to do things. That's for evaluation. If you ask the school to do an independent educational evaluation, if you don't include their or don't agree with what they came up with, those are some ideas about that. Here's a whole section on reevaluation of what the timelines are. If there's a change in identification or placement, here's information about that. Here's just information about the IEP meeting, how quickly, for instance, It has their, you have to have an IEP meeting at least 30 days after that evaluation report or the reevaluation report. So it's just, again, giving you some ideas in terms of those timelines. There's stuff in here about student discipline. So if you're wondering whether or not this school is following regulations in terms of how they're disciplining your child, it has the timelines in here. Same with due process, etc. So again, I'm not going to go into big detail, but I'll put all three of those: the annotated evaluation report, the annotated reevaluation report, and the timeline guideline for you guys to check out. I'll send that to Lakin. All right, back to the PowerPoints. Okay, I'm going to take 2 seconds out and just say, are there any questions at this point before we move on? Feel free to, it's such a small group, feel free to call out or just, as I said, put a comment in the chat box.
Can you hear me, Carolyn?
I can.
Okay. I'm better at talking than typing. I'm an OT with early intervention, and on the requirements for services. Okay, one of our frustrations as OTs is that we have children that have sensory deficits. It's always disappointing when they turn 3 and they go to the IU13 and they don't receive services because they don't have autism. So one question is, who diagnoses SPD? We've often been asked, you're an OT, can't you diagnose? And I said, no, I can treat it. I can do my sensory profile. So who is the person that would treat that? Also, the same with ADHD. We have kids and the parents are like, well, who do I see? Who's going to diagnose my child?
Right.
So those are 2 questions. Oh, and I was going somewhere else with that. And I just lost my train of thought. So what do we do with these children anyway?
Okay, all good questions. Let's start with the first one. You don't have to have a diagnosis for autism. Sensory stuff and autism often come hand in hand. Okay, a lot of kids with autism, in fact, if you look at the DSM-5, there's now a bullet in there saying it's not a required bullet, but it's one of the bullets that could be an indicator of autism is that the child has some sensory issues, overreactions, underreactions to sensory input. But a child that doesn't mean you have to have autism to get OT. You can get OT for, perhaps there's an OHI set up for other health impairment that you could get in there. Or if here's the thing, it gets back to that access to education issue. Same with orthopedic issues, PTs talk about this all the time, and says, oh, but the kid's gait is awkward, or the child needs X, Y, and Z for PT. If the child's navigating the school classroom all by itself or a building all by itself, they can get up and down the stairs, etc. Yeah, they could probably benefit for some private PT, but the school isn't necessarily required to do it. So, and same with OT, if this child is able to access that education, then that's the key. That's the absolute key. So I work with quite a few kids that don't necessarily get OT via early intervention or even at school age, but they go to a private agency to get OT outside of that, and that's insurance funded. Your other question in terms of who diagnoses sensory issues, I'm no expert. Let me just start out with that one. It'd be probably better there's a woman by the name of Heather Fry, for instance, at IU13 that runs the school age OT and PT situation. So she might have a better answer than mine. But I will tell you that the times that I've been involved with kids that have sensory issues, it's the OT driving the bus. It's not uncommon for the OT to be the one, not necessarily diagnosing, but certainly doing the assessments that show how that sensory over or under reactions to environmental stimuli is impacting their ability to learn, and therefore the OT services that can happen. I've worked even with kids that are getting OT for eating issues. Maybe they only eat crunchy things, or they only eat, soft things or whatever. So I'm not sure it's a accurate statement to sort of say a blanket statement of saying you have to have autism to get OT, or that it's something that's not considered. Does that help?
It does help, and I do realize that. I mean, I know what years ago I saw a picture of the PET scan, that there's an actual colored image, colored MRI, so to speak, of the brain with sensory processing, one with autism and one with both. So, I mean, how many people get a PET scan, but there's an actual scientific picture that can prove that.
Right.
But, we often see children with sleep disorders, children with feeding disorders that are not accepted into IU13. And so at such an early age, it's hard. And then the parents are like, they're not getting OT. Patient, where can I go?
Right. And it is, I mean, Schreiber is a great place in Lancaster County. And I know most of these parents aren't from Lancaster County, so I don't know what's out in your area, in the where CPARC is, but there are private places. I saw a kid today that was in my office for a diagnosis of autism, and they got certain services within the early intervention program, but also went on their own for their own private OT. So it's a mix and match, but I'm really happy. Your frustration is a great example of where I think it's a sort of a semi-blurry line about what are schools responsible for and what they aren't responsible for. So I think that your frustration is probably what a lot of parents are feeling sometimes, saying, wait, my kid needs this, and why isn't the school providing it? But it's back to those two questions. Does the child have a disability, and is it keeping them from being able to access education?
Okay, so then the question always comes up, if my child's not sleeping, how can they focus and concentrate? If my child can't eat, is he going to be able to participate in school? How can they say that those things don't matter? And that's not even going into some of the kids that can't self-regulate or have very poor interaction skills, can't follow directions.
Right. And now you're getting outside of my skill set, frankly, in terms of the sleep issues and things like that. I know that Hershey has a really good sleep situation. They also have a really good feeding clinic for kids that have limited food preferences, et cetera. But it's a medical versus educational model. And I obviously, without knowing any of these kids, and for time's sake, I don't want to get into too much of the weeds here, but if I had a child who was a young child and they had horrible eczema, okay, so when they went to preschool, they were scratching because they're feeling lousy. I would go to a doctor for that. I would go to a specialist for that. I wouldn't expect an educational system to address that. So it's back to that education versus medical model. Okay, for time's sake, any other questions that anybody else has? I see there's something in the
I did get one in the chat. It says, is there any advantage to IDEA, sorry, it wasn't capitalized.
Yeah,
IDEA diagnosis over another? For example, is it better to have autism versus other health impairment? Does it make a difference as to a certain level of required funding on the part of the school?
Oh, that's a good question. Here, twofold. The disability, the identified disability, does not drive what's in the IEP. The kid's needs is what drives the IEP. So you could have a child with OHI and autism, and the OHI child has lots and lots of specially designed instructions and goals, et cetera, because their needs are so great. And maybe a child with autism just attends a social skills group once a week or has itinerant autistic support, whatever. So don't get caught up in the disability category in terms of what level of services, because the child's needs, what the IEP team, including you all, decides the child needs, that's what drives the level of intensity of I've worked with kids that have autism, identified IDEA disability of autism, and they're in general education. I've worked with kids with OHI that have, or life skills classrooms, things like that, where the kid has some cognitive disabilities, where they're in a self-contained setting. So don't get too caught up in the disability per se. As far as funding in terms of schools, leaning towards one identification versus another because they think they're going to get more money. Honestly, I don't know offhand, but I will tell you, after 20 years of working intensely in the educational system, I've never heard anybody ever say, hey, you know what, we'll get more money for that one, so let's use that disability. It should be driven by the specific child. The one other thing I wanted to mention with this is that from my knowledge, the only service that is disability specific in Pennsylvania is Itinerant Autistic Support Services. And for those of you that don't know, Itinerant Autistic Support is a teacher specializing with autism who comes in almost like a speech therapist would, or an OT or a PT, comes in as a related service and meets with the child, consults to the teacher, etc., but maybe an hour a week or 2 hours a week or 2.5 hours per week, whatever. It depends on the child's needs. And that itinerant autistic support teacher cannot be, the regs say that the child has to have that identification of autism, IDEA identification of autism, in order to get that itinerant autistic support services, which is sort of wacky, frankly. But I was at a special ed law presentation recently, and some of the special ed administrators were saying, are we going to get in trouble because the child doesn't have the autism label, but we're giving itinerant autistic support anyway? His response, and I think it was pragmatic, was to say, it's not following the regs, but you're probably not going to get in trouble for providing too much, beyond what you need to provide, what you're required to provide. But as far as all the other disabilities, I know of no other disability that's so linked to the service that the child's getting. The other myth that's in here, and this one I'm 99% sure this is true, is that you do not have to have a speech and language impairment disability identification in order to get speech therapy. So for instance, a child with autism, one of the core features of a child with autism is that they have some qualitative impairments, communication. So they might need speech to work on conversation skills and that kind of stuff. But they don't have to have the IDEA disability category of speech and language impairment in order to get speech therapy. All right, what other questions do people have at this point?
That was it. Hold on. I think that is a school's reluctance to ever give an autism diagnosis for IDEA.
That you feel like schools are hesitant to use the autism identification? Is that what it says like? And is that, am I interpreting that right?
Patty, do you want to? She said yes. I just wanted to make sure.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Thank you. I'll tell you what. I would say that's not true for one real reason. If you go to PDE, Pennsylvania Department of Ed, and you look at the incidence of certain IDEA disabilities across the years, the autism label has skyrocketed over the last 10, 15 years. I mean, ridiculously skyrocketed. Not ridiculous because it's bad, but just significantly skyrocketed. So no, I don't think that there's any hesitation on the part of schools if the child meets the criteria for autism and needs specially designed instruction to have that identification. Yeah, but it's interesting to look at. If you go back, remember I said specific learning disability was the most common one? Autism used to be a much smaller percentage of the special ed kids, and now it's a lot higher than it used to be.
She said it may be our district specifically.
Maybe. I would frankly get yourself well versed on IDEA and what's the definition of autism. If you get an outside evaluation done, and the autism is, especially if they do a assessment called the ADOS, which is considered the gold standard. So it's not just your pediatrician eyeballed your child and said, yeah, he has autism. If that practitioner, outside practitioner, implements the ADOS as the way of figuring out whether or not the child has autism, you could take that evaluation back to the school. That said, schools do not have to accept outside evaluations. It gives you a little bit more ammo. It gives you a little bit more power to say, hey, Dr. So-and-so said my child has autism. But At the same time, schools are not mandated to accept an outside evaluation. They usually do, frankly, but they're not required to.
When I send out the PowerPoints to you guys, we actually have made some resources here, kind of simplifying the medical versus educational, because we have this conversation weekly with parents. I can send that out with the PowerPoints as well for you guys.
Any other questions in there in the chat that you want to share?
It just says the response I have is a medical diagnosis is different from an educational diagnosis of autism, which is correct. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
Like I said, I'll send that paper out to you guys. And if you have any questions, you can always contact me afterwards too.
Absolutely. And one way to see that difference is to go online and Google IDEA and definition of autism, which, like I said, is this little paragraph, and then Google the American Psychiatric Association's definition of autism, and you'll see it's a much more extensive listing. Some districts are very comfortable identifying autism. A lot of school psychs that I know of in our districts in like certain limited counties are now able to administer the ADOS, that gold standard I talked about. So they're more comfortable doing it. And some districts are not. The other thing to keep in mind too is most districts should, because if you look at the American ASP, which is the not American Association of School Psychologists of Pennsylvania, their stance is that school psychs should be allowed to identify and diagnose ADHD, but there are still some psychs out there, some districts that go, no, we need a medical diagnosis to do that. But the reality is districts don't have to get that medical. They should be able to do that.
The districts around here do not. They give a,
Is that?
Yeah, it's a at risk or possible symptoms of it, but they will not give that diagnosis, at least in Cumberland and Perry that I deal with. So
yeah, I would go to ASP, the Association of School Psychs Pennsylvania, because I happen to work with and very good friends with the president of ASP, and that's absolutely her stance. That said, if they are not willing to actually diagnose this, but they're willing to do that OHI diagnosis, now their health impairment, and provide the IEP and the specialized design instruction, is it worth making a big deal about? If they're getting what they need through an IEP, I wouldn't worry about whether they said show signs indicative or suggesting ADHD, that kind of thing. If your child's getting what they need, that's the bottom line.
I'll send out another paper. It's titled Label versus Need. I'll send that out as well. So.
Wow, copy me on that. I would like to see that. All right. Any other questions before we move on?
Nothing came in. So.
All right. So let's move on. So I want you to know roles and responsibilities of each of the people at the school setting. So the school psych's primary role is to do evaluations and reevaluations. They're the only ones that can do it. So that's why, if there's testing involved. So that's why, they spend the good majority of their time, testing kids, writing up reports, MDE meetings, etc. And as I said earlier, follows a bi or triannual evaluation timelines for students identified with disabilities. And so the one thing I always like to remind parents is, if you're, say, trying to get eligibility for an outside agency that requires, and the one that's used the most is an intellectual disability category. And if you're trying to get services outside and you go to the school and say, hey, I need my kid tested because I need a new IQ test and a new adaptive, that's really not the school's role. A lot of them do it, and a lot of my psychs do it. But what you want to try to do instead is be really strategic, that when your child's due for that every 2-year evaluation, in this case for intellectual disability, you want to say, hey, I'm anticipating needing an updated version of the IQ and the adaptive scores. Please include testing. I think we need to do testing, and then you can use that test results to go out and get the services from the agencies in the community. But otherwise, try not to ask school psychs to do testing in between that 2 and 3 year timeline, because they've got a bunch of other kids that are within that 2 and 3 year timeline. Depending upon the district, school psychs could do hundreds of evals a year. It's their caseload's pretty tight. that one we covered. Oh, and you should know that for reevaluations, if they decide that no testing is necessary, then the psych doesn't need to be involved. It can be the teacher can actually write up the reevaluation report. My experience has been that the psychs are almost always involved to some extent anyway, but regulation wise, it could be the teacher and the special ed administrator and the parent deciding. Sometimes the psychs conduct functional behavior assessments, especially if the district doesn't have a behavior consultant on their team. So sometimes they'll do that. And sometimes they facilitate social skills groups or individual counseling with kids as a related service, etc. But those are the main primary responsibilities of a school psych. So let's talk about other team members. Let's talk about the school social worker. And the school social worker, and for your knowledge, the PDE recently updated their requirements for what a school social worker certifications, things like that, what they have to have. But basically, their main tasks are to liaison with families and community agencies. So they're sort of your go-between, helping you, get medical assistance or helping you with other things or linking you up to if you need housing issues or housing support. They might link you up to a local company and agency that helps folks with housing or food or food stamps, whatever you need. So that's a big part of it. They help families access funding, insurance, etc., which is sort of the examples I'm giving. And they sometimes take the lead on truancy. Truancy has been a big deal. And especially with COVID, the truancy rates have gone sky high, unfortunately, especially once schools went back to in-person. The kids that were less than agreeable were, the truancy definitely went up with them. And then the next person that's often on a school team is the school counselor. And their main role is to provide counseling regarding academics, vocational plans, kids that are graduating in high school, things like that. And sometimes some individual counseling as well. So, any questions as far as the roles of school team members? Pretty straightforward. All right. So let's take some time talking about strategies to facilitate a strong sense of teamwork between parents and schools. Because if you've got a child with special needs and you like where you live, you guys are sort of tethered together for the next, potentially, until your child's 21 years old, or even 22. If they turn 21 during that last year, they get to stay the whole time. So it's really important for everybody, not just parents, but school systems. And I've done the same sort of a complementary workshop for school staff in terms of how to facilitate teamwork, relationships with parents and families. It works, takes two to tango. So let's talk about what sort of characteristics can facilitate that strong sense of teamwork. So there are basically 8 characteristics of a successful team, and we're going to go through each of them individually, but let's just list them to start. The first is clarity in team goals, and the second is clear roles. So those sort of mesh together, in my opinion. So making sure that everybody has the same goals. Everybody on that team should be focused on that student, period. Bottom line. They shouldn't be focused on funding. They shouldn't be focused on, personnel issues. They shouldn't be focused on whether or not the special ed teacher lives down the street and she's got a horrible, you think I'm making this up, as the special ed has, doesn't take care of her yard and all this sort of stuff. So the parent of the student with special ed is mad because her house values are now going down. I'm not making this up. That was an issue in a MDE meeting I was at. It should not be focused on any of that. The goals have to be focused on the student. So and schools know the same thing. They know that that's the theme. So if you're feeling you're at a meeting and you feel like people are sort of going tangential in other ways, say, hey, you know what, let's just stick with my kid. Let's just think about focus on, so we can work as a team to make sure our goals are student focused at all times. Clear roles. Heaven knows we've been talking a lot about what the school roles are and the roles and responsibilities. But I will tell you, as far as the family roles, absolutely, you are a crucial part. I've been to 3 MDE meetings recently where I was supposed to observe the school psychologist as an, to do an evaluation of their work, and the parent didn't show, and we couldn't have the meeting. The bottom line is you can't have an MDE meeting without 3 people: teacher, parent, and the special ed administrator, or LEA. If you don't have those 3 people, you can't have an MDE meeting, or an IEP meeting. So that's why you guys are part of that trilogy. It's really important for you to take yourself seriously. Also, that back to what I said earlier about that your input should be very important when your child's reevaluation is coming up. It's due every 2 or 3 years. When it's coming up, if your input should be sought by the district to say, hey, you know what, little Bobby's reevaluation is coming up. What do you think? Do you think he needs to do testing? Do you think we need to work on this? I have my psychs have a spreadsheet that they document. They've asked every parent, they've asked every speech therapist, if there's a speech therapist, anybody that's on the IEP team, and the parents included, and they document what each IEP team member said in terms of whether or not they think additional testing is necessary for that upcoming reevaluation. So you have a lot of power and you have a lot of rights, and that's why part of why I wanted to go through all that IDEA and Chapter 14 for Pennsylvania and the guidelines, the stuff like that. You have an incredible amount of rights, so know that your role is essential. Okay, so just to list some of the other characteristics of a successful team. Clear communication, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. Beneficial team behaviors, which will give you some examples. Well-defined decision-making procedures, balanced participation, established ground rules, and awareness of the team process. Okay, so we're going to go look at each one of these individually, and I want you to start evaluating in your head your own relationships with teams. And moving forward, keep in mind that these characteristics of a successful team can apply to your team with a school, or it could apply to if you're having IBHS services in your home, or that they're a team too. In fact, I've done this same workshop to agencies that provide IBHS. So what we're talking about now can be sort of generalized to any kind of team that you work with that has to do with services for your child. So let's look at each one of those. So the first one was clarity and team goals. Are your goals defined in clear terms? So say to yourself, okay, when we have those meetings, do they start in sort of a haphazard way, or do they start with somebody taking the lead and saying, okay, the reason we're meeting today is to do X, Y, and Z. It's not an event session. It's not a, a time for everybody to, get caught up on something. I've been at meetings, and this is my pet peeve. I've been at meetings where there's no clear agenda. And then the pet peeve is everybody's got their laptop up and they're supposedly attending the meeting, but they're answering emails, etc. You need to make sure everybody's goals are that we're going to attend. It'll be a shorter meeting if we just focus on what we're here for. And these are our goals. The same way I started tonight's presentation by listing our goals. When you have meetings with the school, go in there write them down. These are the 2 or 3 things, 4 things at the most that I want to make sure we accomplish today. The next one, can attainment of those team goals be measured? As much as possible, I would want you guys to be comfortable saying to school staff or IBHS staff, where's the data? How are you going to measure? You're saying that, you want my child to improve in their social skills groups. What is the operational definition of what kind of skills are we looking at? What exactly are those definitions so that we're all on the same page? How are you going to measure those changes in behavior so that you can know that the child is progressing? If you get any kind of progress reports that say things like, she's shown much improvement, what does that mean? You want data. You want to be able to say she went from only interacting with peers 3 times a day to now she's initiating interactions 20 times a day, whatever your goals are. So you want to define those goals as much as possible in some sort of measurable term. Does everyone know what the team's goals are? Sometimes it's sort of implicit. You think everybody's on the same page and they're not. So you want to be overt. Don't assume that everyone understands the team's goals. And there's mutual decision and discussion allows for clear team goals. So it's okay for you to go, you know what, let's step back a minute before we get into the weeds. What are our goals for today? And let's make sure we're all on the same page. Next one is clarity in team member roles. I've certainly been beating that one to death. So make sure that everybody knows what each person's role is. It can be very disheartening for parents when you go to an MDE meeting or any kind of school meeting or an IBHS meeting, and there are 12 people around the table and you. And it's really easy to sort of sit back and go like, oh, I don't want to question anything. Make sure you, if somebody's at the table, the meeting should have started with everybody introducing themselves and saying what their role is. And then if you don't understand, you absolutely have the right to say, I'm sorry, you said you do such and such. What exactly does that mean? You're a special ed consultant. What exactly does that mean? What do you do? So allow them to define their roles so that everybody's on the same page. Okay, so that one we've spent a lot of time about. Next one, clear communication. Staff should avoid jargon and acronyms. If you're in a meeting and they're talking about differential reinforcement, a contingent, frequency data, blah, 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 or the psych is reading their report and the test results, and it all has to do with, this standard deviation and that, whatever. Pull them back, say, excuse me, there's no terms I understand. You need to please define your terms. When I do those formal observations, when I watch those, my psychs, my 18 psychs, almost everyone has gotten the feedback, use user-friendly, family-friendly terms. Stop using the jargon. Nobody's going to be impressed that you're using this fancy schmancy language. If they don't understand you, you're not doing your job. So all my staff know now to not use those jargon, don't use acronyms, ABA, I said IBHS, stands for Intensive Behavioral Health Services, sorry about that. Try, if your people are using those acronyms, then you need to ask them to define their terms. Be direct but diplomatic. It's okay to be direct, but absolutely want to be diplomatic, because again, these might be your best friends for the next, up until your child's 21 years old. Ask for confirmation or understanding as well as examples. So if a school staff person or a community services team that's working with you, if they come up with they say something, it's absolutely okay to say, can you give me some examples of what you mean by that? Or how is that what you're saying, this kind of technique, what does that look like? You're allowed and you're actually encouraged to do that because you're a huge part of that team. And of course, making sure that everybody's on the same page. So let's look a little bit deeper, because communication is key. You all know this. Marriage, any relationship, whether it's a marriage relationship, or a neighbor relationship or a sibling relationship, whatever. Communication is key. I've been married 37 years to the love of my life, and he and I communicate really, really well. And there are times though that we're, on different planes, and I think we're talking about this and he's talking about that. So I'll say, hey, wait a minute, let's make sure we're talking about the same thing. So when you look at your team's communication, are the messages clear and direct? And just a sidebar about this, as texts are being used more and more often and emails being used more and more often, the possibility of miscommunication with texts, especially emails are pretty bad, but you got the little emojis and all that kind of stuff. And texts, you have emojis too, but texts are, the advantage of text is they're short and dirty. The disadvantage of text is they're short and dirty, because if the less information is provided, the more possibility that you're going to get misinterpretations of what you're communicating. So make sure that when you're communicating with the team, communicating with them, that if you just say something like, oh, I just feel like nobody's doing their job, it's too vague. You have to say, I feel like I looked at the stuff I'm getting back from the speech therapist, and she's supposed to be in there twice a week for 30 minutes a piece, and the notes I'm getting is she's only there 1 day a week. Okay, so that's data. And it's clear and direct exactly what your message is. How does the team communicate under stress? I've been at meetings where people are getting pretty hot under the collar, and probably some of you have as well. That's fine. And I'm a big believer in saying, you know what, let's take 5, or maybe we need to stop now and meet again tomorrow because it's just getting a little bit too heated. That's okay. The same way that if my husband and I are starting to have an argument, you go, you know, let me take a walk around the block and then we'll get back to this, because it's just, you're not going to be productive any more than when you're working with your own child and they're starting to get escalated. I always tell parents, when that bell curve of they're starting to get agitated and then now they're really escalated and now they're calming down, the top part is not when you try to reason with them. They're done. Any more there would be the time to reason with me if I was really escalating. The time is before and after. So there's got to be a certain level of calm to make sure that people are working well. That's why a lot of times having an advocate with you sometimes will help you feel less stressed, because they can take notes or ask questions and you can just listen and talk, you know, obviously, but you don't have to feel like you're taking notes as well as participating. Next one, how does the team respond to disagreements in decision making? If you're working with a team, whether it's a school team or, you know, a community services like IBHS, you want to make sure that there are going to be disagreements. Every team has a disagreement, but you want to make sure that you're talking about why you feel one way and they might feel another way, and maybe there's some sort of meeting of the minds. If you become like Congress is currently, where it's like this side of the aisle, that side of the aisle, and that's silliness. There's no compromise. There's got to be some meeting of the minds in terms of coming up with decisions that everybody's comfortable with. How does the team solve problems? If you're at a meeting and the team just says, "Oh no, we know better. We know what we're doing. You don't need to question us." I was at a meeting one time years ago, and the mother was really livid. She had a right to be, because the special ed administrator said, "You ask too many questions." Oh, you're allowed to ask as many questions as you want, because you really have, you want to be able to leave that room fully understanding what's being told, fully believing that you were part of that discussion and the problem solving, et cetera. And the next one, how does the team's communication affect the lives of the individuals we serve? So back to this idea of being student focused. So if the communication's, going well, you're probably going to get much better special education services in the school, and you're going to get better community agency services in the home as well. So you want to really always funnel down to the child, and how is our communication impacting positively or negatively the child's progress. I always like to talk about nonverbal communication as well, and I can't underplay the importance of nonverbal communication. Depending upon the research that you look at, it could be anywhere from 75% upwards to close to 90% of a communication is based on nonverbal cues. So you all have been at a meeting and somebody rolls their eyes, or they sigh, or they shuffle in their seat, or they're, like I said, doing emails on their laptop. That's not communication to say whatever you're saying is not important to me. And that's not a terrific way to have a meeting, because it's dishonoring everybody's participation. It's disrespectful. So not only watch other people's and call them on it. I've been at meetings where a parent will say, "You know what, I noticed that you just rolled your eyes, and that, I feel like that's making me feel like my input isn't important." You're not yelling at the person. You're not screaming, yelling. You're being honest and direct and diplomatic. I'm blind as a bat without my contacts in, and I swear I can't have a conversation unless I have my glasses on or my contacts, because I'm not picking up on any of those nonverbal cues. And then the last bullet, just some things to think about with nonverbal communication. Congruency means that your nonverbal communication matches your verbal communication. Consistency means that you're pretty predictable and stable in terms of how you show your nonverbal communication. Because if there's one thing that can be very destabilizing for a team, is if one day somebody's nonverbal communication is giving one message and then the next day they're giving another one, or their verbal communication, frankly, for that matter. All right. So next one, effective feedback within your team. So say there is some sort of disagreement or something you need to bring up. This is all about communication. We're still in that general theme. When you give feedback, here's some general guidelines to keep in mind. Start with a positive comment, okay? So, or an empathetic comment. So say the teacher says something to the effect of, I really think it would make sense to get rid of this program, the parent likes, to get rid of this program because it's just not, I don't like how much time it takes them. Okay. Well, pretty lousy comment from a teacher. So you could start with, hey, I know your day's busy and I know it's hard to juggle all this kind of stuff. Okay. Both of which are true. But by starting with that positive empathetic statement, it opens the door a little bit for whoever you're talking to be a little bit, or talking to be a little bit more receptive to whatever you're about to say. And then the next thing you do is describe exactly the behavior of concern. So I really know you're busy and you've got a lot of balls that you're juggling and all that kind of stuff. But I feel that what you're doing is you're throwing out this a program that I think, the data shows has been very effective with my child. And then relate why these behaviors are a concern. I'm worried that if you take that program away, his reading skills are going to go downhill because we've tried other reading programs. He wasn't showing the progress that he's showing on this. And again, notice, stay in student focused. Share and ask for possible solutions. So let's talk about it. I know you got a lot on your mind. This is going to be a lot of time. Are there ways that we could be flexible in terms of the daily schedule, or are there parts of this reading program we could incorporate while other parts might not be as important? So you share, and notice it says share. It's not all you talking. It's at this point, it should be a reciprocal problem-solving conversation. And then you agree on a route. Everybody says, okay, this is what we've decided to do. And then you schedule a follow-up meeting. And I can't underemphasize the importance of that either, because if I've been at many meetings where everybody thinks we're on the same page, we're going in a certain direction together, kumbaya, and then things fall apart. And then either the parent or the agency or the school staff, doesn't follow up. And 3 months later, they find out, well, yeah, I did try that reading program for a day or two, but it really didn't work. You have the right to be able to say, you know what, we've had some really good conversation here. I'm really interested to see how this decision that we've come up with, how it's going to work. Why don't we meet in a month and talk again about it? So don't leave the meeting until that follow-up meeting is scheduled. If you're the one receiving feedback, so maybe you're getting some feedback that's making you stressful or defensive, etc., listen to what they're saying. Breathe. A lot of times when somebody's saying something that's pushing your buttons or maybe a little bit concerning, or you're getting defensive, it's really easy for your brain to stop listening and to start coming up with what you're going to say next. So try your best not to do that. Try your best just to listen, try to understand what's being said first. Then you want to try to find a point of agreement. And the point of agreement, more often than not, in say the school team or a community agency, goes back to that child-centered approach. Hey, look, the point of agreement here is we're all here to help Sarah. So what can we do best to help Sarah? So that's reframing everything and redirecting everybody's attention back to that point of agreement. Try your best not to generate excuses or be defensive. I know it's hard, been there, done that, but it does tend to take things in a direction that you don't want to go. Assure comprehension, meaning say, you know what, what I'm hearing you say is X, Y, and Z. Is that what you're saying? Or could you give me some other examples? Because it's making me a little defensive. Okay. Clarify by paraphrasing. Okay, what I hear you saying is blah, 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 blah. Is that what you're saying? Don't change the subject. This is the derailing that everybody does, whether it's with spouses, kids, teams, etc. Is you start getting defensive, somebody's giving you feedback, and you do the what about? Well, what about him? He's not doing that. Or what about you? You didn't do such and such, right? Don't change the subject. Stick with the subject at hand. Make it an interaction, suggest solutions, and again, schedule that follow-up meeting. So those are just some guidelines in terms of how to give feedback and how to receive feedback. Here are some examples of beneficial team behaviors. And, some of them are easier than others. You want to have some mutual respect there. I've been at meetings where, give you an example. As I said, I've been doing this almost 40 years. I have worked with probably thousands of kids on the autism spectrum at this point. And every time I diagnose a child, and it's the first time that child gets that autism diagnosis, I say to myself, this is the first time those parents are hearing this. This is the first time they will remember this day for the rest of their lives, even though I'm thinking, oh, they're just like the Joneses, or they're just like the Smiths, or whatever. I give them that respect because it's hard when you're in a field, whether it's education, community agencies, whatever, you sort of feel like, oh, it's just another day at work. Or you say something like your discounts what somebody says, say you're at a team meeting and you say, well, I'm really worried because Joey, hit something against the wall, and the teacher goes, oh, you think that's bad? We had a kid that, broke glass last week. That's not respectful. So you want to make sure there's that mutual respect back and forth. Honesty and diplomacy, I keep driving that one home. Take responsibility for one's own behavior. So be honest with yourself to say, you know what, am I doing anything to negatively impact this team? And what do I need to do instead? Sometimes it's, if you take that advocate, sometimes they might take you aside afterwards and go, you know what, I noticed that you were getting a little bit loud, or whatever's going on. And so that you can get an objective viewpoint as to what's starting to, that you want to just maintain that diplomacy, and maybe you're not taking responsibility for your own behavior, because it's one big mesh, everybody's tangoing there. It takes more than two to tango. It takes lots of people to have a team. You want to be optimistic yet realistic in terms of your attitudes. So you want to go in there with the thought we're all going to work well together, but also not feel like the teacher that's got 25 kids is going to be able to solely devote their attention to your child. That wouldn't be realistic. Absence of breaking into cliques. That's really common with teams where it'll be these two. I'm working with a team right now that the school team and the community team, IBHS team, and the IBHS team is under the same umbrella as the school. So some of the folks that provide in-home behavioral support also work at the school. And this one particular family loves to sort of dig for dirt. So they'll be like, oh, well, when you were at school today, what did my kid do? And what did they do? And then the IBHS folks sometimes get less than professional, and we'll start, instead of going, well, he didn't have the best day or whatever, okay, we'll be like, oh, he was terrible and the teachers did that. Now teachers, or parents rather, sort of thrive on that. They now have this a spy that's letting them know what's going on in the school, which you should know what's going on in the school. Absolutely. But you need to be careful it doesn't turn into these cliques where these two people are talking and those two people are talking, but everybody's not talking to each other. Make sure everybody's motivated to achieve mutual goals. We covered that one. And sensitive to the family system. As I said, people that have been in the field for a long time sometimes start to forget that your kid is your kid, and that your life with that child is all you know, and it's incredibly important. So you want to make sure that the team you're working with is sensitive to your family and your family's needs. Next one is effective decision making. So when you are making decisions, here's some of the rules. Define the decision in clear terms, so everybody knows exactly where they landed. I personally take a lot of notes. If I'm in a meeting, I'm typing away all the time, because I'm really good at remembering all the options that somebody, that the team suggested. But there are times where I totally forget, where did we land? What was the final decision? So I take notes all the time with meetings, so I can go back. Oh yeah, we decided this is the way to go. Gather information from everybody and make sure everybody's contributing, so the decision is by everybody. Identify some alternatives, weigh the evidence of each alternative. There's an old model that they used to use called the SODAS, SODAS, which stands for situation, options, disadvantages of each option, advantages of each option, and the solution. So it's a sort of a nice framework to come to a decision together as a team. Take action, obviously, and then review your decision over time to see if it made sense, if you need to modify. The next one is a balanced participation. When you're at those meetings, whether it's school meetings or community agency meetings, everybody should be participating. If I can't, it drives me a little nuts when I'm at meetings and there might be 12 people around the table and the teacher talks and the the parent talks and maybe one other person talks and everybody else is just sitting there, especially with Zoom meetings. I've seen that increase where they've got their, video off, and for all you know, they're, working on a report or not participating at all. So you really want to make sure that everybody is equally participating. It's okay for you as a parent to go, okay, Sarah, I've noticed you haven't given any input yet. What do you think might be the best way to address this issue or teach this skill or whatever? If there's one member that tends to dominate, it's really important if it's to point it out. And again, diplomacy is what it's all about. To say, you know what, Bob, we hear your opinion. I love it. Thank you so much for giving us that. But I really want to hear everybody else's so that you can sort of squash that tendency for one person to dominate. Is participation based on someone's role rather than their skills and knowledge? You want to make sure it's based on their skills and knowledge. The role is important, absolutely, but you want to make sure people know what they're talking about. The next characteristic of a good team is established ground rules. And what I mean by ground rules is just like, what are the expectations? What are the of the team? What are the rules of that team meeting? So how do people prefer to be in terms of communication? Do they want to meet in person? Do they want to do by Zoom, etc.? The emphasis on collaboration and moving forward is a ground rule that's really important. So and you've all probably been at meetings every once in a while, we're at a meeting and you feel like, gosh, an hour has gone by and I don't feel like we've moved at all. So if the same way the classroom sometimes will have a poster that says class rules, you want to have sort of an explicit rules of what you're expecting these meetings to accomplish and what you want to, the attitudes you want done. And you want those efficient meetings. You want to start time, end time, staying on topic, etc. The next characteristic is awareness of the team process. And these are just some of the, when you look at the research out there in terms of teams being developed, it's not uncommon for them to go through these stages. So forming is just, you're new to a class, maybe your child went from elementary school to middle school, and now you're getting to know the middle school team, or it's a brand new IBHS team that's involved. So you get this forming where we're just sort of feeling each other out and finding out what everybody does and what they're, developing that kind of initial relationship. Storming means, and it's not uncommon, where there's a bit of a bumping heads in terms of, okay, who does what are we doing here? What are our goals? Norming is when people start getting into that idea of, okay, this is what the expectations are. We're expected to be honest, diplomatic, etc. Whatever those rules are for your team, excuse me. And then the last one is performing. And that doesn't mean you have to go through these stages. This is just sort of a framework you can think about. Okay. The next characteristic, or general things, that I wanted to bring up, because those are all the characteristics, is that general ideas in terms of how to decrease negativity and enhance team building in your teams. The first one is evaluate your own thinking patterns and personality preferences. We've all been at teams where we really hit it off with one team member, but not so much with another team member. We're all human. That's going to happen. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you don't have preconceptions in terms of what one particular team member is going to be just because they remind you of somebody else you worked with in the past, for instance. There's a really neat thing that I'm going to do with my staff next week, where we looked at, there's some questionnaires in terms of how do you, what's your work style like in a team is basically work. So it's a way of looking at what do you like to, how do you like to be told things, or how do you like to approach things, or are you introvert or an extrovert, that kind of stuff. And then what's neat about it is it gives you an idea of what sort of personality style you have in a working team. And then if you're working with somebody with a different kind of personality style, approaches that might be the most effective. But there are lots of those things online if you want to check them out. You want to be proactive rather than reactive. So it's really easy to be reactive and putting out fires, but before the meetings, before you communicate with people, think ahead. How am I going to say it? How am I going to do it, etc. List and review positive aspects each day. So I used to work with, let me put it this way. It's not uncommon for teachers that support special ed kids with behavioral challenges to only call home when there's a problem. And as parents, I'm sure that you've been there, where the phone rings and you go, oh man, what's going on today? I always push with parents and IBHS teams, et cetera. Make sure you're calling home when they had a really good day. And in fact, if anything, the frequency of when you do the really good day is more than the bad day, because you want to make sure that you're focusing on when your child's doing well. Same with comments for you for the school. Let them know neat stuff. I was at a meeting last week where the parent had sent a note in and then talked about it at the meeting where the child had gone for gone to a restaurant. Now that they're opening up more and everything, and the child did really, really good at the restaurant, best he's ever done. That's cool stuff to share with the other team members. Recognize no one's perfect. I mean, I know that's easier said than done, but everybody's going to make mistakes. Differentiate realistic versus, pessimistic thinking. So it's okay to be realistic, but don't be pessimistic. Other things, be flexible. Teams need flexibility. Rigid team doesn't do well. Don't make assumptions in terms of what people are saying or doing. I was working with a family a few weeks ago, and they were making assumptions that what was going on in the classroom. And I had been in the classroom, and what they were assuming wasn't happening at all. But then when we had a meeting and that we were able to clear the air, it was obvious that they had misinterpreted what was going on. But they wouldn't have known that unless we were able to sit down and talk about it. Recognize your own influence and responsibility within the team relationship. Be honest and diplomatic. Boy, you've heard that one from me. Recognize and appreciate that your own accomplishments and those of the other team members. I tend to, I used to be an on-site administrator at a school for kids with autism that had some really seriously challenging behaviors. And every Friday afternoon after the kids had left, I'd make chocolate chip cookies the night before and bring them in and take them around to reinforce the kids. And those of you that are the teachers, and those of you that were here last week know reinforcement is important. So that was my way of reinforcing them. But the reason I bring that up is because I wasn't just handing out cookies. I was saying, hey, you know what, Sally, I saw you earlier today and you were so patient when, little Joey was doing X, Y, and Z. I really appreciate your professionalism, blah, blah, blah. So make sure you're noticing those, and always maintain a professional staff. And parents will go, I'm not a professional. Guess what? You are a professional. You're a professional parent, and you need to make sure that you maintain that professionalism in these meetings and your interactions with all the team members, because otherwise it's just going to impact the team negatively. And hold on. A couple of do's and don'ts here, just to keep in mind too. And there, it's a lot of overlap with what we've talked about, but don't argue. You can acknowledge other people's concerns and give your own ideas, etc., but try not to turn it into an argument. Don't try to convince or reason. And that sounds sort of silly, but the reason for that is because when two people are trying to convince the other to be exactly in agreement, that's probably not going to happen. Because if two people have very strong opinions, the chances of one saying, oh, now I totally understand and I'm completely on the same page as you, probably isn't going to happen. So it's more important to understand the other person's perspective and let them understand your perspective so that you can come up with a meeting of the mind. Don't refer to attitude problems. You have a bad attitude, that kind of stuff. That's only going to dig you deeper. Don't ignore the negativity. If you're in a team and it's negative and everybody's, dreading meetings, etc., the next meeting, pull it up, go, you know what, I got to say, when we've been meeting, I feel like there's this negativity going on. I really want to try to work hard with everybody to get rid of it. Don't take stuff personally. Again, easier said than done, but try your best. Don't dwell on the negative, and don't get caught up in an unstated norm of negativity. Some people really enjoy being negative. And I'm sure some of you have come across those people where all they want to do is gripe and all they want to do is, make sarcastic comments, things like that, because that's sort of where they get their goodies. When that becomes sort of the unstated norm in a group, it's not going to be effective. So try your best. If some, maybe one or two members are starting to get negative, don't get caught up in it. Battle it with positivity. Some do's: acknowledge other people's concerns, state your observations, very clearly, build others' self-esteem and confidence, provide that praise and shaping, even if it's what I mean by that is praise something that's not exactly what you want yet, but it's getting there. So you're shaping that behavior. Encourage and expect success. Assume others want to be successful and happy, because most people want to be successful and happy. And then do focus on those positive attitudes and behaviors that you see team members do. So there's just some things to keep in mind. So wrapping up, what I want you to sort of leave here with, and then we have some time here for a Q&A. What misunderstandings did you have before today's workshop about the school's roles and responsibilities? We can talk about that when I'm done with these 3 bullets. Is there any way you can modify your own approach in order to work more collaboratively with schools or with service agencies? And how can you facilitate positive relationships with all team members moving forward? You don't have to be best friends with everybody, but you have to work well as a team so that ultimately the impact's going to be on your child. Okay, I am going to stop sharing and let us have some conversation here, or Q&A, whatever you want to use this time for. Don't be shy, it's a small group. I hate Zoom meetings. All I see are a bunch of names.
I'll piggyback off some ideas, just throwing stuff out there that we make recommendations for here at CPARC. Actually this morning I had, so this mom actually typed up, says, my IEP accommodations, and they actually put a picture of him and their information, and then it was my instructional accommodations that the parent felt that was needed for the IEP, my goals this year, my strengths, so they just listed out different things, my struggles, I love, and then it was a list, and then she added some characters there, and what do I like, and it's a list. And I've suggested this for parents before. I've never actually seen a parent do it before. So I was super impressed when this mom brought this out. I was like, that's so cool. I want to show people.
Absolutely. Because parents, you guys know your kids more than anybody else, and to be able to give that information to whatever team you're working with that's supporting your child is huge. How did it go over?
They went really well. The biggest concern was they just didn't have enough information, and they're just nervous about next year because he does have, he's kind of like that in between autism. Like he has some academic needs that need to be addressed at a lower level, but he's capable of being with general ed students. So it's kind of like a in between, but they just need a lot more information. That's our biggest tactic as an advocate, is we just ask questions. A lot of times we know what it probably looks like, but we're guaranteeing if we're guessing, the parents probably have no idea what it looks like.
Absolutely.
So we ask those questions and we're like, can you tell us what this looks like in a normal school day of how you're implementing this? And that usually eases parents, because they just get the details that they're lacking from the actual document, because it just vaguely states what the service could look like, but you don't know in detail what that actually looks like through the day.
Absolutely. In fact, I've worked with parents that, with everybody's agreement, the teacher will, or the service provider will videotape, or on their phone, do a little mini video movie of them actually doing the intervention. So the parent can actually see it as well. Now I saw somebody put it, I think something popped up that somebody else does that kind of thing. I've done that, especially when going to a new school, going from elementary to middle, etc. You're absolutely right, Erin. It's a great idea, because it's a blank slate when you move to a new school or to a new home or whatever. So the more you can fill in those gaps, the better.
And the other thing is, it just keeps you on track too of things that you want to bring up, because in the moment when the conversation's really into it, you just forget things that you want to address prior to that meeting. So a lot of times when I'm on the phone, which average 45 minutes to an hour per phone call with a family, we're talking about a lot in an hour. So I'm writing notes and I'm like, okay, so what I want you to do is make bullet points of everything you want to come up with, and then we'll talk about it at the meeting. Because most of the time, by the time we get to the 5th bullet point, they're not remembering the 5 other things after that. So it's just a good tactic to keep on track.
Absolutely. I use bullets all the time, you know, whether it's, I just want to remember the main things I want to emphasize, or otherwise you leave the meeting and go, oh gosh, I forgot to bring up such and such.
And I've had parents, you know, at the very beginning of IEP meetings, it was first thing in the morning. I think it was like 7:15 in the morning. So it's already rough. But they actually made muffins. She brought muffins in for everyone. And not everyone ate them right away, but I'm telling you, it set the whole mood for that meeting that was supposed to be pretty contentious when we were going into it. Coming out of it, everything was solved. Everything was great. I was like, wow, that was the first time I've had food offered from the parents. So that was like a pleasant surprise.
Absolutely. In fact, I've been in meetings where I suggested parents do that. And I've suggested it to teachers too, and other folks. But the other advantage of beyond this is hospitable, and, you know, we're all going to, you know, sort of a sign of I want to work together on this, is that if you start to be asked a question that you're really not sure what the answer is, you take a bite while they're still asking. You take a bite and then you go, like, of course I have the answer to that, no problem, but I wouldn't want to talk with my mouth full, so I'll just give me a minute. And it gives you 10 seconds. Or if they're asking you as a parent something and you know you're going to get defensive, take a bite of something just to take that 10 seconds to keep yourself together and be able to respond in a diplomatic way. Absolutely.
And the other thing that I always tell parents, if you truly don't understand something that is being relayed to you, don't pretend you know what is happening. I have so many parents that are like, well, I just, you know, after I was so confused, ask the questions. And, you know, when I'm there, I always try to re-explain it if I can visually see that the parents are struggling with it. But the school team sometimes just need to reword what they're trying to express.
My husband has a theory, and I, you know, when he's targeting at me, I don't like, but it's true, which is correct, or a clear communication is the responsibility of the communicator. So if the school is not communicating stuff in a way that you can understand, it's not your fault. It's not because you're stupid or anything. It's because they're not communicating clearly. So you have every right to be able to say, I'm sorry, I don't understand that. Tell me more. And if it takes a little bit longer, takes a little bit longer. Better you understand what's going on.
And I'll send some of those resources out. So the whole reason why they're called bulletins that we do. They are very simple 1-pagers because the process itself with special ed is very tedious, long, and confusing for most people. So we just simplified it and made it very simple language for families so that they can understand it. So we have a bunch of resources. If you guys ever need anything specific on any processes in special ed, I'm certainly glad to hand them out to you.
Excellent. I saw Patricia or Patty said, I appreciate your advice to make the focus the student the entire time. I just had a teacher say goals were standard and there was a process followed each time. Process should be individualized. You're absolutely right. In fact, that's what the IE is. IE is an IEP, right? I mean, you need to make sure that everybody recognizes that it's all about your child at that moment. Good point. Thanks.
So does anyone else have any additional questions or comments before we wrap this up?
It's time for the drawing, I guess.
Yep. All right. I'm going to quit the recording and then I'll do a couple more announcements at the end.
Thanks for everybody. Thanks for coming though.